Imagine an artist whose name echoed from St. Petersburg to Rome. Orest Kiprensky, a genius who painted nobles and poets, a man who captured the very soul of his era on canvas. His brush was like a magic wand, transforming mortals into immortal images, and his talent opened doors into the highest circles of society. He achieved all that a man of his background could dream of: fame, recognition, commissions from the wealthiest people in Europe. But history, as we know, loves bitter irony, and its most poignant story was written not on his canvases, but in his own fate. At the zenith of his fame, in sunny and eternal Rome, he met her. A little Italian girl, almost a child, with the enormous eyes of a frightened doe. Driven by compassion, the artist took the orphan under his wing, wishing to save her from poverty and give her a future. A noble impulse, a chivalrous gesture, wasn't it? However, this act became the beginning of a story filled with whispers behind his back, ambiguous rumors, and one very strange, dark tragedy. A story that turned the great painter into a hero of scandal-mongering and presented him with a choice upon which not only his reputation, but also his peace of mind depended. We will now journey into the labyrinth of Orest Kiprensky's soul to try and understand: where lies the line between mercy and obsession? Was he a benefactor saving an innocent soul, or a man ensnared in the web of his own passions? And who in reality did that mysterious Italian girl become to him? A saved angel or a fatal temptation that led him to the brink?
To fully comprehend the abyss he stepped into later, we must understand the abyss he emerged from. Orest Agamovich Kiprensky, born in 1782, was marked by ambiguity from his very first breath. In the records, the son of serf Adam Schwalbe, in reality, whispered about in all the surrounding estates, the illegitimate son of a powerful landowner, retired Brigadier Alexei Dyakonov. This status, a master's bastard, as the people would say, was both a brand and a hidden advantage. He was a slave by law, but a master by blood. He lived in a world where his mother was his father's property. This initial duality, this rift in existence, became the chief sculptor of his character. From childhood, he learned to live on the fault line of two worlds, truly belonging to neither. The formal manumission granted by his father was merely a fig leaf covering his social nakedness. Freedom on paper did not erase the scornful glances and whispered gossip. He was an outsider among his own, and one of them among strangers. And this feeling of alienation became fuel for his incredible, almost painful ambition. He had to become someone, not just someone, but great, so that his name, not his origins, would speak for him. And salvation came from an unexpected source, from the tips of his own fingers. While other children played, Orest drew. He drew obsessively, furiously, turning charcoal, chalk, any available material into a tool for understanding the world. It was not just talent, it was his personal form of prayer, his way of escaping the cage of his social position. His childhood sketches already revealed the incredible psychological power that would later make him famous. He didn't just copy faces, he peeled open souls. His gift was so evident, so unlike a mere childish pastime, that it was impossible to ignore. Dyakonov, seeing in the boy not just a reminder of a fleeting weakness, but a reflection of divine fire, made the only possible move. At 10 years old, Orest was sent to St. Petersburg, to the educational school at the Imperial Academy of Arts. This was not just a move, it was an ascension. From the world of a serf's hut, the smell of manure and lack of rights, he entered a world of marble columns, the scent of oil paints, and high ideals. But the academy was not paradise, it was a harsh purgatory. Here, among the scions of noble families, he, a nameless upstart, had to prove his right to exist with every stroke of his brush. And he proved it. His works were bold, emotional. They broke the cold canons of classicism, infusing them with living, trembling flesh. He collected awards, medals, laudatory reviews, but his greatest victory was different. He forced the world that tried to humiliate him to see itself through his eyes. He turned his brand into a mark of distinction, proving that true aristocracy is the aristocracy of spirit and talent.
Having conquered Petersburg, Kiprensky yearned for where his soul drew him, to Italy. For a 19th century artist, this was not just a journey, but a sacred duty, a rite of passage. Italy was not a geographical point, but a metaphysical concept, the homeland of art, the cradle of harmony, a place where the very air seemed saturated with the genius of Raphael and Michelangelo. He traveled there as a pilgrim, eager to touch the source. And Italy not only met, but surpassed all his expectations. It intoxicated and liberated him. Rome greeted him not with the silence of museums, but with the roar of life. Bustling squares, narrow streets where ancient ruins or Baroque masterpieces lurked around every corner, the eternal sun bathing everything in golden light. All of it became a revelation. The cold, austere palette of Petersburg was replaced by the riot of southern colors. It was here, in this melting pot of cultures and epochs, that his talent found its ultimate freedom and power. He shed the last remnants of academic constraint and began to paint as he felt, impulsively, passionately, deeply. His brush became a seismograph of the human soul. He painted not just portraits, he created visual biographies. His works captured not poses, but moments of truth, a fleeting smile revealing hidden pain, a proud curve of the lips hiding insecurity, or a depth of gaze that could read a whole life. Such painting could not go unnoticed. The fame of Il Russo Miracoloso, the miracle Russian, spread throughout Italy. Roman aristocrats, Florentine bankers, European bohemians gathered for the winter. All dreamed of visiting his studio. Commissioning a portrait from Kiprensky became a mark of prestige, almost like owning an ancient statue. He became one of them in high society, a man whose opinion was valued, whose company was a source of pride. The culmination of his triumph was a commission from the Uffizi Gallery, the greatest museum in Florence, a treasury of world art, offered him the chance to paint a self-portrait for its collection, an honor bestowed only upon the chosen few recognized as immortal during their lifetime. Imagine that moment, a boy born a serf, now to hang alongside Titian and Rembrandt. This was the pinnacle. But it is at the pinnacle that the strongest winds blow. Success did not bring him peace. His Russian soul, prone to reflection and introspection, could not simply enjoy fame. He was full of internal contradictions. Pride coexisted with insecurity.
passion for work with a craving for bohemian revelry. And somewhere there, in the shadow of his deafening success, in the labyrinths of his restless soul, the plot of his greatest tragedy was already maturing, waiting for its moment to unfold on the very same Eternal City's stage.
It was during this period, at the very peak of his fame and internal turmoil, that fate placed in his path a figure who would become both his salvation and his curse. It was not an encounter of equals, not a social acquaintance. On one of Rome's poor, sun-drenched and dirty streets, he saw her, a 10-year-old girl, Anna Maria Falcucci, or simply Mariuccia. She resembled a frightened animal cast from its nest, thin, in rags, but with enormous, unchildlike, serious eyes that reflected all the horrors of street life. For Kiprensky, an artist obsessed with finding beauty even in the ugliest, this encounter was a blow. In this dirty, abandoned child, he saw not just an orphan. He saw what he had always sought in art: violated innocence, a living embodiment of tragedy. Perhaps in her vulnerability, he unconsciously recognized echoes of his own orphaned childhood, his own loneliness in a vast and hostile world. His reaction was instantaneous and utterly impractical, dictated not by reason but by heart. He didn't just give her money, he decided to pull her out of that environment, to rewrite her destiny. This impulse was a mixture of genuine compassion, romantic idealism, and perhaps a touch of vanity, the desire to play the role of a benevolent genius, a deus ex machina. He took Mariuccia from the street, washed her, dressed her, and to give her an education and protect her from the world's temptations, he placed her in a secluded convent boarding school. He became her guardian, her only link to the wider world. This act, undoubtedly noble, appeared extremely eccentric in the eyes of Roman society. A lonely bohemian foreign artist, known for his passionate nature and a little orphan, this story instantly spawned the wildest and most piquant speculation in Roman society. Kiprensky unwittingly created ideal material for gossip. He immortalized her image on one of his most poignant canvases, known as Girl with Poppy Wreath. From the canvas, an angelic creature looks at us with a pure, clear gaze, but this gaze already harbors the shadow of future drama. For the artist, it was an act of creative interpretation, an attempt to capture the very innocence he had vowed to save. But for the public, this portrait became tangible proof of his strange fixation on the child. While he saw in Mariuccia a future virtuous matron, whom he was sculpting, like a sculptor from a raw piece of marble, society saw a potential victim, or, even worse, a future mistress whom the aging genius was preparing personally for himself. This duality of perception plagued them from the beginning. He built a future for her within the walls of the convent, far from dirt and vice, paying for her upkeep, sending instructions. He sincerely believed in his mission as an enlightener and benefactor. But good intentions, as we know, pave the road to hell, and his noble impulse was poisoned from the start by the venom of public suspicion. He created an aura of exclusivity around the girl, but this aura had a dark side. It forever linked her name with his own, making her a hostage to his reputation and his passions.
And very soon, these suspicions found a terrible, almost material embodiment that turned salon gossip into a real criminal drama. The fact is, Mariuccia's orphanhood did not occur as a result of illness or accident. She had a mother, a young, vibrant Italian woman whose beauty, ironically, led her to Kiprensky's studio. She was one of his models, posing for the large and significant painting Anacreontic Tomb. She was part of his world, a cog in his creative machine. And one day, this woman was found in her modest dwelling. She had not simply died, her end was horrific and mysterious. Her body was disfigured by severe burns. This detail, gruesome and inexplicable, instantly elevated an ordinary tragedy to the rank of sinister mystery. Who and for what could have so cruelly dealt with the poor model? The Roman police, not distinguished by particular scrupulousness, began an investigation, and the most obvious suspect lay on the surface. Of course, it was him, Il Russo, the Russian artist. He was wealthy, he was a foreigner, he was known for his volatile, unrestrained temper, and most importantly, he was closely connected with the deceased. The last weeks of her life had passed under his gaze in the studio. Too many threads led to him. Kiprensky was horrified. He defended himself desperately, tried to shift suspicion onto his Italian servant, assuring that the latter had been pursuing the woman. Perhaps that was the truth, but in the atmosphere of existing rumors, his justifications sounded unconvincing. Public opinion, that ruthless judge, had already delivered its verdict. The scenario in the minds of ordinary people was simple and logical, like in a cheap novel. A passionate artist, obsessed with the beauty of his model, an argument, a flash of anger, and a tragic outcome. And his subsequent guardianship of her daughter in this logic looked not like an act of mercy, but a cynical attempt to atone for guilt or, even more frighteningly, a desire to possess the last remnants of his victim. The police, having conducted their investigation, found no direct evidence. The case was closed for lack of proof, leaving behind a thick stain of ambiguity. But for Kiprensky's reputation, it was a death sentence. From a genius, he transformed into a monster. From a benefactor into a villain with a mysterious past. And most striking is that even after enduring this hell of humiliation and suspicion, he did not abandon the girl. He continued to pay for her boarding school, write her letters, as if this child were his only anchor in a world that was crumbling around him. This dark, unsolved story became their shared secret, a bloody knot that bound their fates irrevocably, much stronger than any ties of gratitude or guardianship.
The poisonous fog of scandal enveloped Kiprensky in a dense, suffocating cloud. Rome, the city of his triumph, became his prison. Every exit from home turned into an ordeal. Yesterday's friends and patrons, upon meeting him, either hastily crossed to the other side of the street or gave him icy, condemning glances. The doors of salons, where he had previously been met with applause, were now closed to him. He found himself in a vacuum, in social isolation, which for a man of his disposition was more terrifying than poverty. His art, fueled by the energy of life, admiration, and interaction, began to wither. He could no longer work in a city where every stone seemed to whisper accusations behind his back. In 1823, he fled. He fled Rome as if from a plague-ridden city, leaving behind his fame, his friends, and her. Mariuccia remained in her convent boarding school, a little recluse whose life now depended entirely on the money and instructions of a man she barely remembered, and about who she had surely heard terrible things from the nuns. This departure marked the beginning of a long, almost decade-long separation. Kiprensky went to Paris, then returned to Russia, trying to find oblivion in work and a change of scenery. But the ghost of the Roman tragedy followed him closely. Something in him was irrevocably broken. His later works lost their former lightness and brilliance. A deep, unyielding sadness appeared in them. He painted portraits of Russian aristocrats, but the eyes of his models seemed to reflect his own melancholy.
He was an exile not only from Italy, but also from his own spiritual paradise. And what about Mariuccia? Years passed. She grew up within the strict, ascetic walls of the convent, transforming from a child into a young woman. What image of her benefactor lived in her consciousness? Was he for her a saintly savior, distant and incomprehensible, or a figure of fear linked to the most terrible tragedy of her childhood? She received money from him, occasional letters, but was deprived of the most important thing, living human presence. This multi-year pause was a time of maturation. For him, a time of tormenting reflection and longing. For her, a time of character formation in complete isolation from the world. This separation was either to finally break their fragile bond, or, conversely, to prepare the ground for a new, even more incredible and shocking turn of their shared story.
More than 10 years passed. Kiprensky, who was already over 50, exhausted, tired of wandering and spiritual turmoil, could not bear it and returned. He returned to Rome as one returns to a crime scene or to the source of one's greatest love. And here, in 1835, he saw her again. But before him stood not a frightened girl, but a 24-year-old beauty. The years in the convent had not only not broken her, but had also lent her demeanor an inspired purity and restrained dignity. The meeting of two people separated by a decade and such a dark secret was like an explosion. What did he see in her? Not just a grown-up ward, but the living embodiment of his dream, an ideal he had once created for himself and which had now gained flesh and blood. And what did she see? Not an aging, scandalously famous artist, but her only protector, a demigod who had once descended to her on a dirty Roman street and changed her life. At that moment, all social roles, guardian, ward, crumbled. They were left alone, a man and a woman, bound by an incredibly complex knot of the past. And their relationship rapidly rolled down a slippery slope, leading from platonic care to very earthly passion. What drove Kiprensky? A belated love? A desperate attempt by an aging man to cling to fleeting youth? Or a heightened, almost painful sense of honor, which demanded that he protect the reputation of a girl whose life he had so dramatically altered? Perhaps he believed that only marriage could wash away the stain of the artist's ward with a dark past from her. Her feelings were no less complex. Endless gratitude bordering on adoration, childhood affection that grew into devotion, and perhaps sincere love for the only close person she had ever known. This connection was toxic and beautiful at the same time. Their romance, which they probably tried to conceal at first, soon became public knowledge and caused a storm. The age difference of almost 30 years was glaring. The few remaining friends of the artist were horrified. They begged him, appealed to his reason, predicted his final disgrace and ruin. But they were speaking to a deaf man. Kiprensky, who had fought the world all his life, decided to give it his last and most daring battle. He chose this love, forbidden, condemned, impossible, as his final banner.
He made a decision that became the pinnacle of his rebellious spirit and the apotheosis of his entire life. He would marry her. This step was not just a formality, but a public manifesto. With this marriage, he legitimized everything: his past, his feelings, his scandalous reputation. It was as if he were saying to the whole world,
Yes, this is my life, and I will live it as I see fit. But there was a serious obstacle in the path. Maryucha was a devout Catholic, and the church could not marry her to a schismatic, an Orthodox Christian. To finalize the marriage, Kiprensky had to perform an act that for a Russian nobleman of that era was equivalent to spiritual and social suicide: to convert to Catholicism. This was not just a change from one confession to another, it was a complete and final break with Russia, with the culture that bore him, with the world that, despite everything, he considered his own. He was burning the last bridge behind him, cutting off his retreat, and he did it without hesitation. In the summer of 1836, in a quiet Roman church, their secret wedding took place. The great Orest Kiprensky and Anna Maria Facucci became husband and wife. When the news leaked out, Roman society exploded. Opinions were divided with fierce irreconcilability. Cynics and enemies triumphed. For them, it was the fall of a genius, the final act of a tragic comedy where an old libertine had finally possessed his ward. They saw in it only the triumph of vice and lust. But there were others. A few romantics, seeing Kiprensky not as a monster, but as a tragic hero, considered this marriage the pinnacle of nobility. For them, it was a truly chivalrous act. A man, feeling his guilt, real or imagined, towards the girl whose life he had so drastically changed, sacrifices everything, his faith, his homeland, the remnants of his reputation, to give her his name and protect her honor. Kiprensky himself, according to eyewitnesses, appeared serene and even happy during these brief months of his marriage. Probably for the first time in many years, his tormented soul found fragile equilibrium. He had won. He had reclaimed the right to this love from the entire world. His Maryucha was by his side, his wife, his last harbor. He had achieved the goal of his life. But he did not know that this victory was a Pyrrhic one, and that fate had already prepared its last, most cruel blow.
Their happiness, hard-won through suffering and scandal, proved as fleeting as a lightning flash in the night. It lasted only 3 months. It was a brief epilogue to a long and agonizing drama, a moment of silence after a deafening storm. They lived in seclusion, trying to build their small, fragile world, shielding themselves from the hostile noise of the big city. But the artist's health, depleted by decades of strenuous work, financial hardships, constant nervous tension, and the burden of the past, was ruined. His body, held together by sheer willpower, gave way as soon as it found peace. A common autumn cold, which a young and strong man would barely have noticed, became fatal for him. The illness developed rapidly, turning into severe pneumonia. In October 1836, just a few weeks after the wedding, Orest Kiprensky passed away. He died in the arms of his young wife, in the city that had witnessed his greatest glory and his deepest fall. His passing instantly turned Anna Maria from a happy bride into a destitute, defenseless widow. And here, her story, so brightly illuminated by the gleam of her husband's genius, once again plunges into impenetrable darkness. She disappears from the pages of history as suddenly as she once appeared on them. What became of her? Some biographers vaguely mention that she gave birth to a daughter by Kiprensky, named Clotilde in his honor. But even her traces are lost. How did a young woman, without money, without connections, with a name that carried the stigma of scandal, survive in a foreign country? The answer is obvious. Obscurity, and most likely poverty, awaited her. She remained in history only as a phantom, the last
unsolved mystery of the great artist. So, what were they to each other? Was he her savior or her jailer? Was she his guardian angel or his fatal obsession? Was their connection a great love or a tragic mistake born of loneliness and guilt? This story offers no easy answers. Like Kiprensky's best portraits, it merely poses questions, forcing us to peer into the dark, uncharted depths of the human soul and acknowledge that the line between holiness and sin can sometimes be indistinguishably thin.